Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you to help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And in today's video, I want to talk about that build up to a binge. I'm going to talk about what it is, what might be going on, and how you might be able to use that information to take a different path so that the build up doesn't always lead to a binge. A lot of people, I've said this before, their strategy of trying to stop binge eating, they want to try to stop binge eating by just stopping binge eating. So how many times have you said to yourself after a binge, this feels awful, next time I'm just going to make sure that I don't do it? I don't say have to very often on this channel because I want people to figure this stuff out for themselves, but I'm going to say it now. You have to stop using that strategy because it doesn't work. To say to yourself next time when you're feeling like this, you're just not going to do it. If it worked, you wouldn't be watching this video now. So what it does instead is it erodes your self-esteem. It destroys your self-trust because it's like you keep breaking this promise to yourself over and over again. When we're thinking about the build up to a binge, this is anything that can happen from minutes beforehand to hours to days and even weeks. People will describe to me that they can feel this tension, this build up over the space of several days, and they just know a binge is coming. I would say the most common cycle is probably a few hours beforehand, where maybe you're thinking about this evening, later on, maybe there's sort of this itchiness, this unease. For me, sometimes I would wake up in the morning and the moment I opened my eyes, that tension was there. Like I could feel it, and then I would just know, I'd have this sinking feeling because I would just know that that meant today was going to be a binge day. The binge eating is sometimes spoken about as a release. And this just resonates with me, this idea that there's this tension, this agitation, and then when you finally go into that kind of, I don't care, I'm just going to do this, there can be, sometimes it's almost euphoric, but as a bare minimum, there's this kind of relief and this release where it's like, okay, I can stop fighting with myself now. It's going to happen, we're going to go through this, and I'm just going to have to deal with the consequences afterwards. So I think the most important question is, what is that tension for you? What builds up that tension? Now, I think it's usually one of three things. So it's either going to be restriction, like it could be physical restriction, could be like a mental deprivation thing. There's all this going on with food in your head. Another one could be emotional. Maybe it's something that's not really got anything to do with the food that's building up in your background. And then when you binge, you kind of release these emotions that you didn't really have any other way to do. Or the last one is a combination of both. And I just want to say a thing about the emotional build-up because I think this is one of the most complicated ones to try and pull apart. So I'm not sure if I've used this example on the channel before, but it's like if you take say there's a child and they're going through some horrible stuff at home, they're having a really hard time at home. And so when they're at school, they're acting out, like their behavior is terrible. And they're being punished for their behavior, so they just feel really bad about themselves now. They don't have the mental capacity to be able to put two and two together and go, okay, I'm behaving like this because there's these things going on at home and I have these feelings that I don't know what to do with. They don't know that. Their brains can't do that. I kind of think it might be the same as adults. I don't know if we fully grow out of this, that sometimes we behave in ways that we don't really understand why we did because there's something else emotional going on that might not even be fully in our awareness, or we haven't made the connection that could be driving the behavior. So while some people might act out their emotions that they can't contain with aggression or other kinds of behaviors, maybe some of us do it through food. That's how we act out these emotions that we haven't named, and that sometimes if we haven't named or understood an emotion, chances are we just experience it as a sense of unease or agitation or maybe even anxiety and depression. So I want you to really think about your experience of the build-up to a binge. So often we're focused on the behavior, the bit we don't like, which is when we actually binge. But what was going on beforehand? And I think usually the easiest time to reflect on this and maybe see something you haven't seen before is just after a binge. And this is why people often don't, because you're in that catastrophic state, your emotions are up, or maybe your emotions are down, but you're in the aftermath of a binge and you're very focused on that. And what tends to happen is you tend to look forward and just go, well, tomorrow I'm going to do X, Y, Z, or I'm not going to do this again. Instead of looking back and going, what was going on? What was in my build-up? Where was the deprivation or the judgment around food? How was I feeling kind of in my own skin? Sometimes there can be an event or some kind of emotional trigger that's easily identifiable, but I think a lot of the time it isn't. A lot of the time, I like to get existential on you. I think a lot of the time it's a much more, anyway, for me anyway, a much more existential sense of just being disappointed in who I was as a person. I know that sounds quite dramatic. Other people might talk about that as unworthiness or feeling not good enough. But for me, it was this sort of disappointment in myself, which was so uncomfortable to sit with. But if I didn't recognise that that was what was going on, I had that itchiness, that desire to escape, to soothe, and to numb out with food. I often talk about binge eating as a conflict. There's two parts of you. Part of you wants to binge, part of you doesn't want to binge. Everyone says, no, I don't want to binge, but part of you does. And that's why you do, and we want to get rid of that part. We want to ignore that part. We don't want to have anything to do with it. So we end up trying to destroy the part of us that wants to binge, but in the process, we get in this war with ourselves. So some people's build-up very much looks like this back and forth between whether to binge or whether not to binge. And the more you engage in that conflict, the more you end up fighting with yourself. So again, when you are reflecting and trying to understand your build-up, to try to sort of zoom out and go, what is the debate that's going on? What's the conflict that's going on? And when we rush in to try and fix the conflict, we have to take one side over the other side. And chances are the side that wants to binge will win. Because if you say, well, I just want the side that doesn't want to binge to win, if you've got one side saying binge, one side saying don't binge, it's as if unless you binge, in theory, it seems like that conflict could just go on forever. So sometimes it's like you binge and you feel so much better when you binge. So you think it's the binge that's making you feel better, but really it may be the resolution of that inner conflict. So I think there's a key piece here in accepting that we have different parts of us that want different things, and to be able to tolerate inner conflict without getting right in there and trying to fight it out. To sort of zoom in and be able to see the different parts with more compassion and acceptance, because then you can make a decision from a more gentle negotiator kind of way, as opposed to heavily invested in the stakes of this decision. And when you're reflecting on the build-up, I talk about this tipping point. There's a tipping point where in the build-up it now feels inevitable that you're going to binge. And once you've tipped into inevitability, that's the moment where like the autopilot kicks in and you're going through the motions. And once you've tipped into that, it's a difficult place to try and stop it. So by going back, what people do is they say, well, I just won't do it. I would just not do it next time. But really going back and running through that build-up, at what point would you have recognised what was going on? At what point would you have made a different decision? And in order to make that decision, what would you need to be telling yourself in the moment as well? Because in the moment, you've got these thoughts that go on for you during the build-up. And for as long as you keep believing the same thoughts, you're going to keep ending up in the same outcome, which is the binge eating. And this is why the self-awareness part of this is so key. And being able to reflect with compassion, because if we don't have compassion, we cannot see the things we don't like about ourselves, because we would drop into shame. This is why the compassion part is so important. If you are so frustrated and angry with yourself and you're trying to find out why, you won't be able to, because you're looking through this veil of frustration and disappointment and all these other heightened catastrophic beliefs and feelings. This is why one of the key elements is being able to stop catastrophizing the binge eating. And that again comes through compassion, because it just cools down those emotional jets. So one thing that I started doing after a binge was sometimes I would think, okay, all I was aware of in the build-up was that I was just feeling agitated. It was the only word that made sense to me to describe how I felt before binge eating, was agitation. And so quite often the intention I would set for myself would be from that moment onwards. It's normally nighttime, but I'm a big fan of don't say you're going to start something tomorrow, start it immediately. So if it's 10 p.m. and you've just binged, don't say tomorrow I'm going to do X, Y, Z. Even if you're going to bed, do it from now, if that makes sense. So I would say to myself, I need to pay attention to myself. I need to just spend a bit of time in my own mind. I need to go for a swim. I need to just have a cup of coffee or eat something without being distracted. Because if it is so difficult to be able to be in your own mind without being distracted, there's probably something we're avoiding. Maybe several things. Because why is this so uncomfortable? And I think sometimes in order to find out, we just have to try and do it and see what actually comes up. I know this sounds like it's nothing to do with binge eating, but I often found that the build up to a binge came after a period of time of being completely distracted by things. And I find that if I make space for myself to just be pottering around and doing things without constantly listening, without constantly consuming, whether it's podcasts or audiobooks or anything like that, I feel more grounded. I find myself not wanting food in the same way. I know this sounds like it's nothing to do with binge eating, but I would say that our relationship with our food is parallel to our relationship with ourselves. And so it comes back to this reconnection with us and the willingness to accept all the messy, imperfect parts of being a human being. Because I think tension and agitation builds up when we resist things, when we fight against them, when we believe that we shouldn't be thinking or feeling or behaving the way that we do, as opposed to saying, I am thinking and feeling and behaving the way that I am. What does that mean? What could that mean? Well, I think that'll do for today. Let me know about your build-up. Do you tend to experience a long build-up before you binge? Is it quite quick? Sometimes people who think their build-up is really quick, until they start looking for earlier signs of that agitation, then they realize that maybe this build-up starts happening sooner. Can we get curious about what it is that leads us to this point of binge eating, instead of just saying to ourselves over and over again to stop doing it? Anyway, thanks for watching. See you on the next video.